Welcome to Creative Conversations. Today I'm joined by author, naturalist, and nature sound recordist Andrew Skeoch. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Congratulations on your new book, Deep Listening to Nature.
Thank you.
I've really enjoyed having a read. It's beautifully written, and been looking forward to diving into it and finding out more about it from your perspective.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you, and I'm glad that you've enjoyed reading it. I think as a writer for the first time, writing a book for the first time, there's a huge amount of work that goes into it, and at the end of it, all you want is for people to read it and enjoy it and get something out of it. So that you have is that's gratitude enough.
I'm conscious that you've spent a lot of your life, most of your life, recording nature beautifully, I might add. What was it like, going from that world to the focus of writing a book? That's quite a shift, isn't it?
Well, it happened kind of organically. I've always been curious about our relationship with nature. It's always felt to me as though, as humans living on the planet, we're an animal. We exist in the same way that other creatures do, and yet our lives feel so different to those of other animals. And I've just been like, what's going on? What is our place? What's our relationship? And for me, it wasn't just what can we think of our relationship as being, but what is our true relationship? What is our relationship based in the actuality of our existence? And more importantly, what can our relationship become based on that? So I've always been puzzled about the world and how we can change the way that we live on this planet to be more beneficial to us and not to be such a heavy weight on natural systems.
Mm.
So that sort of conservation appreciation agenda has really informed not only my life and my curiosity, but ultimately our work. And so the sound recording began out of that process of how can I share what I'm hearing in nature, which really began in Matawinchi, because I hadn't intended to publish nature sound recordings.
Oh,
But
right.
after that experience and a few subsequent experiences, I realized that no, nature sound recording is really I just know how to do it. I sort of
Mm.
got an inner instinct of aesthetically how to put together make these recordings and put them together and communicate them to people.
Mm.
Um, but there came a point and a very, very pragmatic business moment when it might have been as much as 10 years ago, maybe a little less, when we looked at our publishing enterprise, which we'd named Listening Earth. And we were doing a lot of overseas trips, very expensive, time consuming, wonderful experiences,
Mm.
but publishing new work from those trips. And we were really sort of committed to it. And then we looked at our business figures and we realized that we were going down by about 15% every year.
Right.
And that this was a result of people moving away from purchasing and owning recordings and curating their own music listening experience into streaming where other people curate it for them.
Mm. Mm.
And we just, I think both of us, it was like a bucket of cold water because both Sarah and I had sort of created this business and we kind of thought there's not a future in doing this. And I think, for a lot of musicians would have gone through this, possibly you went through this experience too.
Mm. Yeah.
And you kind of recalibrate and think, okay, so where to from here? And of course, for musicians, there's the live performance aspect and merch and various other things. But as a wildlife sound recordist, there aren't those options.
Mm.
However, I found that I was being invited to give talks and lectures, and some of them quite high profile. I think Woodford Folk Festival, I was invited to give 3 talks one year, and the ABC turned up to record me, and that recording went out on their Big Ideas program. And I remember thinking at the time, well, if I'm going to be on big ideas, I'd better have a big idea, hadn't I? So it just really made me think about what I'm saying, and
Mm,
trying to draw together all these threads of answering this question of who are we and what's our relationship to the natural world. And of course, listening is such a poignant way, a powerful way of answering that question, because if you want to answer any question about relationship and interaction, it's about listening and communication. So yeah, experiences like that of the big ideas and Woodford. Also, TEDx invited me to give a presentation in Canberra.
mm.
And all of these experiences gradually sort of consolidated my thinking and my ideas. I was beginning to get a narrative of understandings. And then COVID came along, and no public opportunities there. And I just thought,
Mm,
well, now's my time. If I'm going to write a book, now's the time to do it. So I
perfect.
began, and 2 years later, and quite a bit of editing and support from friends, and I had a manuscript.
When someone reads the book, what do you most hope that they glean from it or they take away from having read it? Is there a
Well, I
particular?
think there are two things. I think firstly, for a lot of people, and I do get this feedback quite often, that people in one way or another communicate to me that they're never going to hear the world in quite the same way as they did again. And that sense of enthusiasm and interest and curiosity sparking people's um, interest in going out and listening to nature and giving them some kind of framework of ideas to hang their listening on, that it's not just a case of going out and waving your ears in the breeze. It's a little bit like learning a language. You do actually need to take a while to understand what you're hearing and the significance of it, and the way that different aspects of what you're hearing, different bird calls or different aspects of repertoire and so on, all these, I think of the bush as telling us stories. And so you have to learn to decode those stories. Otherwise, there isn't any meaning. You're just hearing a noise. So I'm hoping that firstly, people glean something from all of that, and it encourages their development of listening skills and
Mm,
attention skills in terms of nature, because I think it's so absolutely important for us culturally at this time that we as a culture reconnect with nature. And you can only do that intellectually and emotionally up to a certain point. You have to ultimately engage your senses, and listening is the overlooked, pardon the word, the overlooked
yeah.
sense,
Yes.
or the discarded or taken for granted sense. And it's so powerful. So that's the first thing. And the second thing I would
Mm,
hope is that if people have got through, you know, all the ideas that I've presented about how nature functions and how you can hear that functionality in the way it communicates, um, then there are actually things to be learned from this and put into direct social practice. And that can be on an individual level, or it can be in terms of the way that we understand our society, our economy, our governance structures, our geopolitics, everything. The way that nature has come to function after 3 billion or so years. A lot of
mm,
the problems that we're dealing with on a global level as a species, as societies, as communities, nature's already solved these problems. And a lot of them, they've solved them communicatively. So understanding that can give us a foundation for a kind of biomimicry. But
mm,
whilst biomimicry is really having its moment now in terms of technology and understanding how we can use the solutions of nature to inform our own technology. But you can think of our social structures as a social technology, and listening to nature and the interactions of how creatures interact can give us some models of how to govern ourselves and how to engage in our social relationships, social structures in a much less costly and much more productive and enjoyable way.
Mm. And having spent, decades in the field and listening so intently and carefully and being so aware of your surroundings, how has such a long period of time doing that affected you personally?
When I first began recording at Mutawinji, I was there for recording for maybe 6 weeks. And in that 6 weeks, I I had the recorder and the microphones with me the whole time. And when I heard something interesting, I'd turn the microphones on and I'd make a recording of it. And when it stopped, I'd turn them off. And so I had tapes, DAT tapes back then,
Yeah.
full of relatively short recordings. They might be short as 2 or 3 minutes. They might be 10 minutes. The longest one was maybe 20 minutes.
Mm.
And I've realized subsequently that, these days I will put microphones out on a tripod and I will let them record for hours and hours at a time. I'll come back with, every morning, and I don't just put one microphone out, I put maybe 3 or even 4 recorders out. So I come back
All
with
right.
masses of data. But the point about it is that when I first began, my listening was as fragmentary as my recordings.
Okay.
I just couldn't keep my attention going for any longer than a couple of minutes. I'd listen and go, oh yeah, that's really interesting. And then no, it's got boring now, and I'll turn off and I'd kind of
Mm.
disengage. So it's kind of this
Mm.
stop-start listening.
Mm.
I think this is, attention span. It's learning to deal with boredom. When I
Mm.
say boredom, I don't mean that nature's boring. It's just that nature can be very subtle and very understated at times, and to
Yeah.
keep
Yeah.
your attention going you know, in response to minimal stimulation is a real skill. It's the foundation of any meditative awareness.
Mm.
So listening is kind of, as I've been developing as a sound recordist, it's all responsive to my listening skills at the time. And so,
Mm.
you know, the way I record has changed and the way I listen has changed. And that's really changed, had its flow on effects into how I am as a person, that, I can be a lot more patient, a lot more less demanding of life, less sort of hung up on things being a certain way at a particular time.
I had this impression of maybe in early on as if you were capturing a best of nature, and then that morph into a hang on a minute, let's just be patient and listen and see what emerges from that stillness and etc. etc. That's kind of what I felt as you were speaking then.
Yeah, no, you've really put your finger on it, Ian. It's when I started, I was thinking of highlight moments, interesting things. Is sort of like audio postcards, really, that I was assembling into a kind of montage of different things. And now I'm realizing that, yeah, there are highlight moments in nature where something really exciting happens. So, you're in the rainforest and suddenly a hornbill comes and flies into a tree. And it's like, oh, wow. But there are also moments where it's quite still and quite silent. And, this idea of listening to the bush for me grew out of a desire to make sound recordings and share those with people as a way of connecting people to natural landscapes and different species. And it's because when you listen, you hear a lot of what's going on. You hear the biodiversity, you hear acoustic diversity, and so on. You hear the different seasons and movements of the landscape through the soundscape. And so originally it came out of this process of learning to listen myself as a Western, growing up in Sydney, biggest city in one of the biggest cities in the Southern Hemisphere. It's like, I had a lot to learn about tuning into the bush myself. But eventually I came to realize the wisdom of that indigenous perspective, that listening is not just receiving sound from this sort of the natural world that we're disconnected from. It's about listening as a process in which you become a part of what is listened to. And And so everything really that's I've put in the book really comes from that fundamental perspective of understanding ourselves in relationship to the natural world around us, which for many of us is a somewhat distant experience. It's just occasional, and we hear some bird song or some frogs calling or something. Oh, that's curious, but we don't know what we're hearing,
Mm.
or what it's actually telling us.
It also brings to mind, in the world we live in today, where our attention spans are just so short, and it's crazy, isn't it? How
Yeah.
what we
I
feel we need to stay entertained, and this is like the exact flip side of that prolonged attention, the patience, the being willing to wait for magic moments. I mean,
mm,
it's very connected to the creative process at large, isn't it? Is
it is,
patience.
and yeah, and as you would know as a musician, you can trace this in the development of music. So, you go back 150 years ago, and people would go to a concert and they would sit there listening to the music intently,
Mm-hmm.
for several hours, and it's music they've never heard before. Something like a
Mm-hmm.
Mahler symphony would go for an hour and a half, incredibly dense, incredibly emotional, so much going on, and at the end of an hour and a half of listening, you're absolutely wrung out. And then it moves through in the 20th century to much shorter pieces of music, to the point where, now it's well, I suppose back when we were growing up, it was LP records, and to sit down and listen, you'd listen to a whole LP, that's three
Mm-hmm.
quarters of an hour. Listen
Yeah.
to both sides. I had an experience where I was being interviewed on air, actually, by two young environmental media folks. They had an environmental show on community radio, and one of them said, "Oh, have you heard of silent listening?" And I thought she was talking about the kind of listening walks that I conduct for people, where we walk in silence and we just tune into the sounds around us. And so I
Yeah.
was talking a little bit about that. She said, "No, no, no, that's not what I'm talking about. This is a phenomenon on TikTok that has really taken off. And silent walks are where you take your earbuds out and you listen to the world around you, and you go, oh, wow, there's stuff going on. Oh, didn't
Mm.
realize all that."
Wow.
Stick it back.
Wow. Oh
So,
my gosh.
yeah, our actual perception of the world has gone from sort of long form attentiveness to this very fragmentary, high information delivery format, where our brains are constantly looking for stimulation, ideas. Once we get the idea, yep, on to the next one. And we have to take in the amount of information that is being thrown at us these days. Nature dispenses information very slowly, very gradually, sometimes imperceptibly.
Mm.
You need a very, very different form of consciousness to tune into it and stay tuned in.
Mm.
So a lot of it just has to do with our media, the way that we absorb information these days. Very fragmentary, very brief, very quick, and constantly changeable. And it doesn't serve us well in terms of those more reflective aspects of life that require longer and deeper and more instinctive connection. We can still do it. We've
Mm.
still got that neural capacity for doing it. You just need to remind yourself. It's a little bit like, if you haven't exercised, getting fit again, you just need to spend a little bit of time building up that skill.
Given the breadth of your recording discography, what's been your most profound moment over the last few decades in that world of sound recording?
The book contains a lot of stories
Mm.
about various times and places that have had an impact on my thinking, that I've wanted to share with readers, because
Mm.
they illustrate an important idea or an important principle. And each of those stories is illustrated with the sound recordings that I made at that time. And the book comes with a soundtrack of nearly 300 audio recordings that accompany the text. So you can actually hear what I'm talking about. If
Yeah.
you're writing sound, you've got to let people hear them.
Yes.
So in a way, the recordings that accompany the book are really some of those highlight moments for me, for one
Mm.
reason or another. They're good examples of something, or they represent moments when, sort of like I heard something and it really made me understand, a particular aspect of the way the natural world functions.
In the book, you've got a symbol of a bird that denotes that there's a recording to listen to, and it was wonderful. It really brought it to life for me, being able to go and listen to all the recordings as I went through the book. That was absolutely beautiful touch to have done that, and it gave it a real dimension to it. And the quality
Yeah.
of your recordings is astounding. It's just
Well,
you're right there. Like you close your eyes and you're there. Um, so many congrats on just the caliber of your work. And whilst we're on that theme, I just wanted to acknowledge as I touched on, you've got a massive you know catalog of work, and it's all been beautifully not only recorded, but the look of your work's beautifully presented, and it's just got a beautiful style to it. So, congrats on your life's work, you and Sarah, with that. Um, and yeah, it struck me that it's a really important record of history in nature's
Mm.
sound, because I was going to ask you, do you feel like there's certain recordings that you've recorded thus far that maybe no longer exist, or maybe because the habitat's been destroyed or evolved or changed? Could that be the case?
I think I've often been asked this, and other field recordists have talked about this. And my conclusion is that nature is just so variable that to kind of try and quantify it and say, well, this is what it sounded like 10 years ago, and this is what it sounds like now,
Mm, mm.
is a very suspect kind of comparison,
Right.
because things just change all the time for absolutely no perceptible reason. It's
Right.
just that natural systems are inherently dynamic.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example. Um, I've lived where we do in the bush in southern Australia, in dry woodlands. And when we first arrived here, we had yellow-tufted honeyeaters. They were absolutely ubiquitous. We used to call them the bush mafia because they've got this black eye stripe and these little yellow ear tufts. Really cute. But they were everywhere.
Mm,
And then about 10 years ago, we started to think, hang on a sec, we haven't seen one for a couple of days. And then it became, we haven't really seen many for a couple of weeks.
mm, mm,
And then it was like they just disappeared. And
mm.
we knew that they were still in the district. They just weren't around the house.
Yeah, right.
Meanwhile, another species had moved in, yellow-faced honeyeaters. They took up for a little while, and then they moved on. And white-eared honeyeaters, which had previously only really been a winter visitor for us, became resident. And then New Holland honeyeaters moved in, which we hadn't seen here at all in all the previous 2 decades. They were down the hill back out on the river flats, but they weren't up on the top of the ridge where we live.
Mm,
So you get these changes. This is just 4 different local species of honeyeaters. They're all in the locality, but they're kind of moving around as communities in response to what? I mean, I look at the
mm.
bush and I think it's the same trees, it's the same flowering, it's the same, suite of insects and food resources here. And what makes the change? And
Mm,
it's, the soundscape in response to these honeyeater movements changes dramatically.
mm.
Why? I don't know.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit cautious of trying to use sound as a kind of qualitative
Mm,
or a quantitative measure. But I think you can use it as a qualitative measure where you listen to the quality of sounds. And to do that, it's not just a case of measuring the acoustic diversity, the species diversity, and so on. It's understanding the relationships between the sounds. And I'm going to give you some examples because we're warbling on about sound here. It'd be good to actually play you some.
Let's hear some, yeah.
So, all right, so I'll play you a little bit of the white-eared honeyeaters that have as I said, these winter visitors that became resident all year round.
Mm.
And one of the things about the dawn chorus is that, and the dawn chorus happens in that first hour of daylight before the sunrise. It's that half light, that twilight. When all the birds start singing, it's mainly a breeding thing. It tells you that and it's mainly songbirds. But it's this great phenomenon that you hear all around the world. And one of the aspects of the phenomenon is that species use different repertoire in the dawn chorus than they will throughout the rest of the day. They'll have a different dawn that you don't hear very much, or if at all, throughout the rest of the day. They also have regional dialects that identify them as regional populations. But one of the things that I love is a process called counter singing, where adjacent birds living on their own particular home ranges, instead of trying to sing over the top of each other, they'll take their turn and they'll call backwards and forwards with each other.
Nice.
So they're listening as much as they're actually singing. And I'll just play you an example of this. Let me jump into screen share. Okay, so this is a white-eared honeyeater.
Beautiful.
And here is a pair of them in spring doing this counter singing. And if you're listening at home, you've got your headphones on. This is lovely stereo. You'll hear birds in either channel calling back, alternating, calling backwards and forwards to each other. And this is a spectrogram of what the sound, the actual structure of the sound, visual representation of the sound. So here we go. So you can hear this bouncing backwards and forwards, and they're using this particular aspect of their repertoire, this little two, sometimes three phrase called this quichu. Now that's what they sound like in spring. In winter, they will sing at dawn. The dawn chorus is nowhere near as rich, and there aren't as many species singing. But the white-ears will sing in winter, but they use every aspect of their repertoire apart from this quichu call, which they do not use at all in the winter dawn singing. So in the winter, what you hear is something like this.
Wow, that's so different.
So all of these things, yeah. So, what I'm talking about in the book is that we become aware of these kind of aspects of bird behavior, and you're hearing the life of the bird and how it uses sound to communicate different things at different times of the year in different ways.
Mm.
The white-throated tree creeper is a member of the tree creeper species, actually a very old family of birds. It dates back to some of the earliest lineages of songbirds. So what you're hearing is a reflection of just how loud some of those earliest songbirds that evolved probably were, having evolved in dense forested environments in early on the Australian continent. Actually, songbirds evolved in Australia. So what I'm going to play you is the call or the song of the white-throated tree creeper, and it's just a repeated piping call. Now, to do this, you think of the breathing involved, and it turns out that unlike us that have sort of a left and right lung, birds have these air pockets in their lungs, and they can use them independently. They also have two sets of what we call vocal cords. The bird vocal mechanism, the syrinx, has two sides to it, so they can produce different sounds simultaneously with the two sides of their syrinx. And in this case, I think the bird's actually sort of triggering one alternately with the other, combined with this breathing thing where they can breathe into one air pocket while expelling air out of the other. And it's
Wow.
just how they do it is mind-bafflingly
Yeah.
complex.
Yeah.
What they've evolved to do, and let me just share screen again. What they've evolved to do is to create a sound like this. And so this species will keep on calling for sometimes half a minute, even a minute and a half, very loudly, with that quick repetition of notes.
Yeah.
And exactly how they do it is just, they're a biological marvel. It doesn't sound like much when you first hear it. You just think, oh, there's a bird piping in the forest somewhere.
Yeah.
But there's when you understand all the backstory to it,
Yeah.
then it becomes, oh, wow.
It's almost
And
like a circular breathing, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, and it may well be, but no one's ever done the research to actually work out exactly where the air is moving at various points to for the bird to do this. But
Mm.
to me, this is the wonder and the beauty of listening to nature. There are all these little sub stories that are going on around you, which, with a little bit of understanding, you come to appreciate.
Yeah, it's amazing, and it's so loud. Like the volume they get out of such a small body is voluminous, isn't it?
And this is one of the things about birdsong is that, they're tiny little animals and
Mm.
they've evolved to produce this whacking great amount of noise.
Mm.
And it's because, they need to communicate across the landscape for various reasons, whether it's to negotiate their home ranges, their geographic living space, or whether it's to communicate with neighboring communities, whether it's to hold foraging flocks, the integrity of foraging flocks together.
Mm.
With some birds, they don't exist in very big densities in the landscape. And so just to find each other in terms of advertising and breeding calls, they need to push it out. And it's a part of the reason that they sing at dawn so prolifically and in the early morning is because this is the optimal time when the atmospheric conditions, the air is cool and it's still, it's
Mm.
the most optimal time during the day for sound to be transmitted. And so this is why birds just have a really good time in the morning, a little bit at dusk as well. But all these things help you understand what you're actually hearing, and that's the intent of what I've put in the book is to share with people, this is what you're hearing, this is why you're hearing it. This is so.
Yeah, beautiful. Have you found that Australia's bird life is quite different to the rest of the world? And if so, what's the main reason for that?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating thing. When I first went to Europe to record, I was just, the bird song there is really quite wonderful, but it's very individual and very virtuosic. You'll get a single male singing its heart out sometimes in the night before the dawn, like nightingales, or right through an extended dawn chorus. In northern Sweden, the dawn is very slow because the sun angle is low, and so the twilight lasts for several hours.
Mm.
Indeed, it may never really go completely dark at night. So I was hearing things that are just utterly unlike what I'm familiar with in Australia. And
Mm.
one of the things that I love about Australian birdsong is that they have simple repertoire, and with, uh, for instance, the white-eared honeyeater that I played for you earlier. It's just that simple phrase, and it's just repeated and bounced backwards and forwards. And so communities of birds will create these lovely sort of patterns of simple sounds. And it just wasn't present in Europe. I was really puzzled. I'd be hearing virtuosity coming from brambles and treetops, but I wasn't hearing these simple sort of patterns. And it really puzzled me for a long time, until I started to recognize that the European landscape is very, very different, geologically and climatically, to the Australian one. Most northern songbirds migrate and they have a short breeding season, so they've got to attract a mate quickly and get on with the breeding. And at the end
Mm.
of the breeding season, those relationships will be dissolved as birds migrate south again. Whereas Australian birds, they have largely, we have an evergreen foliage. That means an evergreen or a continual year-round supply of insects. We have a lot of flowering plants. Nectar is a major food resource in Australia that it isn't in Northern Europe, where nuts and seeds are more. Um, so it just allows birds to live in very different ways. And one of those is lifelong pair bonding and also communal breeding. So a lot of our species, birds like kookaburras, fairy wrens, magpies, some of the most common birds that we're familiar with are all communal breeders. They live in small family groups where the young from one season will help rear the young from the next.
Right.
Um, Choughs, apostle birds, they're all communal breeders, sitellas. So our birds do something different. Their calling is more year round. It's more social. You get things like duetting amongst birds like pied butcherbirds and
Mm.
beautiful duetting calls because
Mm.
they have lifelong pair bonds that they affirm through singing together. Kookaburras do the same thing. We think of it as this chortling laughter, but actually it's a bonding thing amongst a community of or a family of kookaburras, an extended family. Um, so yeah, Australian birds just do things that are much more varied and diverse than what happens in the Northern Hemisphere. It's you get individuality and virtuosity and expression, diverse expression in Northern songbirds, and you get much simpler expression, but much more affirming of relationships, more social and more pair bonding calls in Australia.
Mm. I was just,
And all of it reflects the landscape. So you're literally
yeah,
hearing the landscape sing to you,
yes.
is my way of thinking about it. The climate, the geology, the ecology of food resources and the climate and so on.
I
Mm.
was smiling because I was thinking anytime I've gone to the UK to visit, it's the bird song is so relatively petite, and then you come back home and it's "Wah," in your face, in your
Absolutely.
ear.
Yeah, yeah. And look, it's the same when you go to other parts of the world. You go to somewhere like Africa, and Africa has really, it's full on bird song, the same as we have here. I haven't been to
Mm.
Latin America, but I imagine it would be similar. What happens in Northern Europe is relatively speaking, in terms of bird behavior and bird song, it's the anomaly.
Mm.
And yet, a lot of our ornithological ideas that have originated from European scientists, they're basing it on something that's quite unusual by the rest of the world. So, for instance, their ideas about female birdsong, any Australian would know straight away that female birds sing as vociferously and as beautifully as the males do.
Mm.
You only have to have fairy wrens in the garden to realize that. But
Mm.
for ornithologists from Britain, it was just they just couldn't understand it. It didn't make sense.
Yeah, right.
So it's
That would have been a freak out for them on those first ships when they first landed. They would have thought, "What? That's pretty loud."
well, yeah, yeah, and there's actually the red wattlebird I've heard described by early settlers as being the vomiting bird because it's got these really loud, explosive kind of calls.
Yeah, yeah.
I think even John Gould said something to the effect that the great ornithologist, when he compiled information about Australia's bird life, said that nowhere do you hear the beautiful songs that you hear in hedgerows and woodlands in Britain. It's
Mm.
just not present in Australia. And
Mm.
as an Australian, I've got a different aesthetic. I'd say, well, actually, mate, we've got some beautiful stuff here. You want to listen to some of the most beautiful songbirds in the world. I'd say pied butcherbirds or Indian the Malabar whistling thrush in India is just sublime. And
Mm.
if these birds had been present in the UK, you can guarantee Shakespeare wouldn't have been writing about nightingales. He would have been
Yeah.
writing about, about other birds entirely.
Going back to the book for a minute, I really enjoyed every time you might touch on the indigenous aspect of the land, and the indigenous respect for the land and the way they listen
Mm.
to the land and hear the land. Is there anything you'd like to share about that side of it? Because that made a real impression on me reading the book, those aspects of what you wrote about.
Yes, yeah, thanks for that, Ian. The first thing to say is that I'm not an Indigenous person, and I don't pretend in the book or in person to be representing Indigenous ideas. That's for them to do.
Mm,
What I have done is listen to Indigenous people, and what they have said to me personally has gone in, and I've attempted to integrate it with my own understandings and my own listening journey. And what I hear Indigenous people say repeatedly is you got to listen to country.
mm,
And, this idea of listening to country is becoming such a kind of a meme,
mm.
for want of a better way of saying it. But I don't think as a culture we really understand what on earth Indigenous people are talking about, because they literally mean you got to listen to country.
Nice.
And that means get your ears out there and listen and do the kind of process that I've done without, I've done it because I'm wielding microphones and I'm wanting to make, publish recordings. But for them, it's been because when you listen to country, you understand how country functions. You understand how ecosystems function and how different creatures survive. And so you're learning about the way that the natural world around you works, and that has the implications for survival, and just that's where your knowledge about life actually comes from. And I can't put this, I don't know that I can articulate this strongly enough, just how profound this this difference is, because I I've coined this way of thinking, and I've put it in the book, of thinking about Indigenous cultures as listening peoples.
Mm,
And I don't know whether this is sort of something that is a viable idea, but to me it seems that if you go back far enough in all cultures where peoples are living in intimate relationship with the natural world, and they are gleaning their knowledge of the natural world, not only from observation and experimentation and so on, but listening just gives you so much information, so broad a perspective on what's going on, that it seems to me as though every culture, if you go back far enough, is a listening culture. And you certainly see that amongst Indigenous people that have survived into the modern world. You find it in American Indigenous cultures, from South America, from India, Australian. Yeah, you even find it in Pacific Islands. I found that the guides that we had on islands like the Solomons and Vanuatu, they, for them, listening is just like, yeah, what's what's the big deal? It's like
yeah.
they're very tuned in. They're very acoustically literate,
Mm,
and so to me, this listening skill amongst that you find amongst Indigenous peoples expresses itself in a listening culture,
mm,
and hence me thinking of them as listening peoples. Whereas in our modern world, we've forgotten that, and I'm even speculating that in a way this has possibly had something to do with the difference between European birdsong and the birdsong of the rest of the world, because
okay.
the words that I use to describe European birdsong, individualistic, it's very much about staking out a territory by the male, and attracting a female, and all of these things kind of, if you think that this is the way life is, these are the kind of the fundamental understandings of life, then it doesn't really surprise me that European culture has developed in a similar way. It's all about individualism and expression, and about power over the environment, because you need to create a surplus for the winter. Um, in agriculture, you need to harvest and store the food and protect the animals from the harsh winter and so on. And that impetus, that which has come from the physical environment and expressed in the way that birds live and their songs and their interactions, finds its expression in this concept of profit and of wealth,
Mm.
which is just not there in individual cultures. They have a really different idea of what the values of life are. And so I kind of offer some thoughts on just that, the impact of Western cultures coming into contact with indigenous cultures around the world, but very particularly in Australia, where they've had no contact until 250 years ago, and then suddenly being overwhelmed by European culture. And you're seeing two cultures that have evolved in very different biogeographical regions of the world coming into contact with each other, and just a profound misunderstanding that has created. And of course, indigenous cultures sort of immersing themselves in the land and the way that nature works, and living without those costs of creating pollution and so on, whereas the Western culture is just, yeah,
Mm. Mm.
just exploit resources and throw the refuse away, and landfill. And it's a really different way of living, different conception of living. And as a Westerner, I'm sort of thinking, where did I get this? But where does it come from?
Mm.
How do I
Mm.
understand this? And how do I
Yeah.
understand the relationship to indigenous cultures and to human history? It's, I'm still thinking through these ideas, but
Mm.
you get a sense that how these ideas feed into one's understanding of what one hears in the natural world too.
Yeah, it sort of brings to mind again the treading gently on the earth aspect, and how the
Mm,
indigenous people just seem to, tread gently and look after the place, and there's so much to be learnt from being more aware of it, observing it, and just opening one's eyes and ears in this
mm.
situation.
Well, I mean, the trick really is, and the big challenge that we have is that we don't live as subsistence people anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't think any of us really want to go back to that level of subsistence living. There is great benefits from the civilization that we have. I mean, I'm just looking in the background and I'm seeing your beautiful guitars,
Mm.
the technology. We're talking using communication technology. We're nearly 1,000 kilometers apart, and yet we can have this chat. I mean,
Yeah.
there's the benefits of living in the modern world are fantastic, but how do we do that in a way that conforms to natural systems and indigenous practices, where we don't create these costs
Mm.
of waste, inefficiency, pollution, and climate change, and all the rest of it? And
Yeah.
that's partly a technological question, but it's also a social question of how do we live with each other? Because
Mm.
if we don't communicate and we don't cooperate and we don't listen to each other and we don't
Mm.
create our future together, we're just not going to get there.
Yeah.
It's always going to be one person trying to, dominate another, or one group trying to dominate another. And that's not the way that nature has evolved. This is rainforest in Sulawesi, and it's been over 2 decades since I was there, but I clearly remember walking through this rainforest, knowing that I am surrounded by the most extraordinary biodiversity. And yet there are times when it was really quite quiet. There didn't seem to be much going on at all. And it kind of puzzled me. And I'd be walking up and down the track through the forest, looking for something to record, listening for something to record. And then a single bird would fly in and start calling. And a few minutes later, more and more birds would turn up. And there'd come a point where you just look around you and everywhere seemed to have, there were just birds up in the canopy. They're going up the tree trunks, branches, they're hanging off leaves, they're coming through the understory, they're hopping along the ground. And as they do so, there's just this complete, you're immersed in this sound world of birds twittering and communicating with each other. And this is called a mixed species foraging flock. And they're a real phenomenon in tropical forests. There can be hundreds of birds of multiple species all traveling together as a group. And as they do so, you hear this amazing contact calls going on the whole time. When I was in India, I've got some naturalist friends there, and they call these bird waves, which is a lovely word for them. And they're a real phenomenon in Indian forests too. And they found that they were speculating to me that the first bird that flies in, they reckon it's very often, it's this species, it's a racket-tailed Drongo. And it's a very alert bird. It's got some loud calls, particularly a very noticeable alarm call. But they're also fabulous mimics, and they mimic nearly all the other birds in the forest. Wow. And so they were thinking that the Racket-tailed Drongo coordinates this whole flock of maybe dozens of other species by mimicking all their calls. And so they're kind of following the Drongo through the forest, almost like the Pied Piper. And it's a lovely idea. But not only that, the reason that they follow the Drongo is because the Drongo is like a sentinel. It's like their early warning system. Because the Drongo gives such loud and noticeable, distinctive alarm calls, and the Drongo is very often an aerial feeder. It's on the edge of the forest canopy, so it'll fly out into the open air to grab insects and fly back. So it gets a good view. If there's a goshawk or something around, it will see it and give the alarm calls, and all the other birds can kind of go to ground. Meanwhile, they can keep in contact with each other acoustically, and they can do their foraging, sometimes head down, tail up, looking under bark and under leaves and so on. They can know what's going on in the world around them just by listening. They don't have to keep vigilant in the same way. And so I realized that these mixed species foraging flocks, which are found all around the world, we get them actually in southern Australia, mostly in the non-breeding season, amongst fantails and thornbills and fairy wrens and whistlers and robins. Will travel together in little groups, much smaller groups than in the tropics, but nevertheless they come together in foraging flocks that move through the forest. But it coordinates some of the most important activity in their day, which is foraging and safety. Feeding and being safe from predators. And I'm just thinking, this is a phenomenon that's found all around the world. It coordinates the activity of birds in their most important activities, apart from actually breeding. And it's all synchronized by sound.
Amazing.
And that's, when I'm saying that, sound tells you what's going on, these are the kind of things that I'm talking about. When you encounter a mixed species foraging flock like this, a bird wave, you are hearing the process of cooperation that has evolved amongst multiple species all around the world in the avian kingdom. Incredible. And that to me is like, whoa, that's kind of significant, isn't it?
Yeah, isn't it?
So this is a crinia frog. It's a tiny little animal. It's about the size of my little fingernail.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah, they really are small.
Gosh.
And the thing about frogs is that they live in communities often. And when you get one or two or maybe three frogs, actually, when you get a community of frogs and you listen to them all calling, they call quite randomly.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'll hear this kind of thing. This is 5 different species of frogs, all in a wetland. The most noticeable one is the pobblebonks, the bonk bonk calls. But you hear them, there's quite a random pattern. So they're
Wow.
not calling over the top of each other, but they're creating a huge amount of sound. And the reason is because they're trying to attract mates, not from their own pond or water body, but from possibly water bodies a long distance away. This is necessary for genetic diversity and to avoid inbreeding.
Mm.
So frogs create this massive sound
Mm.
as a kind of an acoustic sort of lighthouse
Yes.
for individuals to find new habitat, move across inhospitable terrain to new
Mm.
water bodies. But when there's only a handful of frogs in a water body, they have to, the random patterning doesn't really work quite so well. What they have to do is start synchronizing with each other to try and create this impression that there's more of them than there actually are,
Ah, right.
and to create as much sound as they can. So what they do is they start synchronizing with each other. And this isn't a kind of rhythmic synchronization. It's more a repetition, but it's based upon one animal responding to another and the other one responding back to that one. And so you get this kind of thing happening. But have a listen to this crinia, as I said, a tiny little frog, so the size of uh, your fingernail. But have a listen to the synchronization of these two frogs.
Mm. Wow. That's impressive, isn't it?
As soon as one stops, the other one stops.
Wow.
And even when there are little hesitations as well, one hesitates, the other one
Yeah.
doesn't anticipate that it's going to be calling at the same point. It follows the hesitation because it's as I said, it's sort of a stimulus response mechanism rather than
Mm.
a sort of synchronized rhythm thing.
Mm. Mm.
Um, so anyway, there's just some examples of the kind of cooperation that is baked into animals'
Yes.
genetics, that you can hear that nature has affirmed cooperative processes as advantageous ones. There are many others, um, but this is what I love about listening: is that you're hearing natural systems, you're hearing the natural world working in such a way as to support all of life.
It's amazing that such a tiny body can produce such an acoustic volume, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it's a little bit like birds. They
Yeah,
have
yeah.
to get the sound out there across a big landscape, and if you're a big animal, great, but a lot of animals, for one reason or another, food resources and so on, they're limited in their size. One of the interesting things is the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere that we all require oxygen to breathe. Animals require that. When there is a higher percentage of oxygen, animals' bodies can grow bigger. And in the history of the Earth, back in 200 plus million years ago, the oxygen content was much higher, and you get these massive insects.
Ah, right.
Um, Millipedes that are sort of, several meters long, and
Wow. Yeah.
these beautiful dragonfly. There's a whole family of these beautiful dragonfly-like insects, which are quite huge. Some of them have wingspans of 2 meters or so, called paleodictyopterids,
Wow.
and they've gone extinct because the oxygen content of the planet has decreased to its current
Wow.
level, and so animal bodies, just simply insect bodies in particular, cannot grow that big.
Yeah, right.
Um, but and because of resource limitations and so on,
Hmm.
you end up with small body size, big home ranges, big landscape, and creatures need to push the sound out, and they've evolved mechanisms to do that. Amongst which is the amphibian sort of throat sac that acts as a
Mm.
resonator. The avian syrinx and even fish have mechanisms for making sound using their swim bladders
Mm.
and various
Amazing.
anatomical processes. So yeah, the
Yeah.
natural world is just it's full of communication of one kind or
Yeah.
another. If it's not acoustic, it can also be things like what's called matrix vibration amongst insects, which is rather than use sound, use the air as a medium to communicate acoustically, they will sit on leaves or stems and root systems of plants, and they will drum on the plant to communicate
Oh, wow.
through the actual matrix of the plant or the soil.
Yeah.
And I think I'm not sure whether I've got the right number here. I think it's about 70% of the world's insects communicate this way. And it's all inaudible to us until you actually get a tiny little contact microphone onto the
Mm.
plants and listen
Mm.
to the insects communicating through them. And it's
Wow.
probably the way insects originally communicated over 300 million years ago. So
Yeah.
before they developed the acoustic way of doing it, there's
Mm.
only
Mm.
really a handful of families of insects that communicate acoustically. Crickets, katydids, field crickets, and also cicadas. They're really the only ones. Every other insect does this little tapping thing.
Yeah. Right.
Um, so there's
Percussionists.
just all this stuff going on in the natural world that science is gradually becoming aware of,
Mm.
and all of it. There's probably only a small fraction that we actually hear that I've been waving microphones at over
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
decades. So
Yeah.
there's just so much.
Yeah. I'm astounded at the depth of knowledge you have around this subject. It's just mind blowing, to be honest. I
You
can
you just
tell.
acquire you could acquire all these factlets.
Factlets. Yeah. Yeah.
But
So
I often think of nature as being the world's greatest game of Trivial Pursuit.
oh
There's
yeah.
just so every species has its life story,
Mm.
and you
Mm.
can researchers spend years looking at
Mm.
just one individual species, one
Yeah.
aspect of it, and how it. So it's just to think that we understand this. Nah, this is
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
But it certainly gives you a sense of information overwhelm, but out of that comes a sense of wonder and gratitude.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think what science is revealing to us is bringing about that sense of social wonder that we have, that an appreciative aspect of appreciating nature is becoming more and more a part of our culture,
Yeah.
and
It's amazing.
importantly and necessarily so.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing so many amazing insights. Every time I speak with you, we could just speak for hours on end, and now is no different to any other time. Um, Thank you for all these insights, and just wrapping up, what is next for Andrew Skeoch? What would you like to be achieving next? What's the goal from this point forward?
Well, I think just to talk about this and to be in the short term anyway, to be presenting to audiences, some of what I've shown you and let you hear this morning is to stand up on my hind legs and in front of an audience and to talk about this is just a deep joy for me.
Hmm.
So
You,
to do more of that, I've got lots of recordings in the archive that I'll put up on Spotify and streaming platforms when I have the time. And having come to all of this from music originally,
yes.
I was a musician, not anywhere near as talented a one as you are. But nevertheless, I love music deeply and was involved with it for quite a while. And then when it began sound recording, I put it all aside. And I'd be curious to sort of get back into composing and writing pieces of music again. But
Mm. Nice.
lots,
Nice.
I'll see.
That's good to hear. Just for the listeners or the viewers' sake, I just wanted to say Andrew's a beautiful lute player, and your album Rockpool Reflections, which you recorded at Mutawinji
Yeah,
back
that
in
was
92, is that right? 92?
yeah, 93.
93, yeah. It's a beautiful album. It's always been one of my favorites, and you are a fine musician. And it would be lovely to hear you record more lute music or write
It's very
lute
nice
music.
of you to say, but as a lover of music, I know my limitations. But yeah, no, that Rockpool Reflections album is I'm still. It was a lovely time in my and Sarah's life, and but I realize in retrospect that really it's two albums. It's the soundtrack that we recorded at Mutawinji, and then there's my music weaving through it.
Mm.
And yes, but it's a lovely listen. Yeah.
It is. It's beautiful. I love it to this day. Andrew has a vast collection of nature sound recordings, which are available everywhere. Am I right to say? On all the
Yes,
streaming
there are.
platforms?
Yeah, they are up on. Although I've still got some to add, but they're all on our website, and we've got
Yeah.
a part of our website where people can just stream and listen as well.
It's just profoundly superb work, the recordings. It's like what we were listening to back in the Sulawesi rainforest. I felt like their wings were going to hit my ears. It was so clear. So,
That's one of the real joys of recording or field. It's called sort of field technique of recordings is to get the microphones into the right spot. And
mm,
the right spot for me is where the action is. And so
mm,
to have the microphones with bird life and animal life just moving all around the
mm,
microphones is I love doing that. And sometimes it results in amusing moments. One of which I'll recount was I had a microphone out in the Australian bush, and I came back to the microphone itself, and it had mud all over the top of the microphone housing. I'm thinking, gee, that's wonder what happened there. And
yeah,
I'm listening back to the recording afterwards, and I can quite clearly hear a kookaburra land not far away
yeah.
and give a few kind of
Oh,
calls, which I could tell it was a kookaburra. Next
right.
thing you hear is this thunk as it lands on top of the microphone and proceeds to whack what was probably a lizard or something to death on the microphone.
Oh,
You know how they grab something in their bill and they sort of
yeah,
whack it and whack it,
yeah, yeah.
knock it into submission. Well, it did that on the top of my microphone.
Oh gosh.
Hence, so
Uh,
I've got a
uh,
lovely recording of that.
Yeah, yeah. I wish you all the best with the book. I thoroughly recommend to everyone to check it out. It's a fascinating read. It gives you amazing insights, not only into the intricacies of bird life and nature and sound recordings, but your wonderful observations of life, amidst all of the detail is really inspiring.
Oh, well, thank you very much, Ian, and thank you for putting the time and care that you do into your podcast. We haven't really spoken about creativity all that much this morning, but nevertheless, it's all part of that broader process of how do we live on this planet and doing the best that we can. So thank you very much.
All the best, Andrew. Cheers, mate.
Cheers. Bye.
Thanks again for watching Creative Conversations. I really appreciate it. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit the like and subscribe buttons and hit the notification bell if you'd like to know whenever new episodes land. Please share with anyone you know who would appreciate this content. If you'd like to help support the production of future episodes, I have a donate link in the video description and a link to my YouTube music channel as well. Thanks so much.